coming into the session.
Ponzo, are you done?
Yes, I am. We can start.
Okay, so I'll make myself host again so that I can start the actual session. Is that fine, Spokazi? You have to make me host, Ponzo, because you are the host now.
Perfect. Poncho, once you've done making Nomta host, you can start.
Should I start the program, colleagues? Facilitator, should I start the session?
Yes, you can. Can everybody switch on their videos? Cool.
Wait, Poncho, do you want all videos off?
Yes, please.
All videos and all audios off, I suppose.
I think maybe when you start just broadcasting, just wait for the attendees to enter.
Okay. Poncho, I'm then going to ask you to just play the music for about 3 minutes, okay? But
Okay.
I'll then text you in the chat section, and then you'll let me know, you'll give me the cue to unmute my mic and my video, but I think about 3 minutes should be fine. Okay.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna start playing now.
Spokazi,
Yes, Prof?
are we going to present with our videos off?
No, they will be on when the time is right.
Okay.
We are now on the webinar has started.
Guys, the webinar has started.
Africa,
Hello and welcome to our African Women's Intellectual Histories Inyathi Buzokwa Phambili Colloquium, which is a collaboration between the Center for Women and Gender Studies at the Nelson Mandela University, the Politics and International Studies Department at Rose University, and the English Department at the University of Pretoria. My name is Porazi Tau, and I am a research assistant at the Center for Women and Gender Studies. Welcome to all of our colleagues that are joining us inside this webinar. We also recognize some of our colleagues, friends from other universities on the continent, to our international colleagues and allies and friends, some of which are streaming live on our Nelson Mandela University YouTube page. Please just note that you may feel free to interact with us. Use the chat section that you have on your streaming site, or some of the attendees that are joining us in this webinar, feel free to use the chat section to engage. Inyathi Buzokwa Phambili is an isiXhosa idiom and saying, which means wisdom is learned and sought from our elders. This colloquium, of course, seeks to recover, to remember, and memory, where it pertains to women's intellectual histories in Southern Africa. For today and tomorrow, we will be centering work and sharing work with you that showcases the biographical histories of African women thinkers. Our colloquium will infuse history, the creative genres of language, of art, as we promote intergenerational voices on the legacies and lessons for the current African feminist decolonial project. All right, without any further ado, colleagues, I want to bring to the platform Prof. Sibongile Mutwa, who is the Vice Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University. Prof. Mutwa is also the current chair of USAF, which is a collaboration and a network of all the universities in South Africa. Prof. Mutwa?
Thank you, Spogazi, for opening the colloquium and for the introduction. Good day, colleagues, wherever you are watching from. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this colloquium. I would like to recognize our Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Muleketi, who has taken time to be with us today. Our Chairperson of Council, Ambassador Nozipho January Battle, the members of the University Council who might be watching and participating in the colloquium, the Deputy Vice Chancellors, the Deans and members of management, the faculties and heads of entities, all the scholars, academics, and the research community that are participating in the colloquium. Today, all the participants, our staff and students from different universities that are part of this colloquium. I would like to really welcome all of you and our friends of our university, the university publics and communities that we collaborate with. I particularly wish to welcome our keynote speakers, Dr. Brigalia Bam and Professor Shireen Hassim, who will be introduced officially during the course of the colloquium. They are our keynote speakers, but I also, with respect, want to also recognize all our speakers that are going to be participating in the colloquium and all the artists that are going to be entertaining us during the next 2 days. I wish to acknowledge the collaborative organizers of the colloquium from our sister institutions, Dr. Siphokazi Magadla from Rhodes University, Dr. Atambile Masola from the University of Pretoria, as well as our very own Dr. Babalo Magoqwana, the Interim Director of the Center for Women and Gender Studies here at Mandela, together with all staff and students in the center. I have to say that, colleagues, in the short life after the center was launched in 2019, the center has gone on to grow from strength to strength, working collaboratively with scholars from other institutions here in South Africa and in other countries in Africa. And I really would like to salute this work, Babalwa and your team. And then I also want to salute your ambition and your intention to keep an eye on growing the talent of young scholars associated with the center. I really would like to commend this. I'm grateful to be able to welcome you all today from different countries and places as we face these difficult times as one world. Geographical boundaries melt as we connect across the globe using our sharpened digital agility that we are learning and improving on a daily basis. We remember with great sadness the loss of life over the past few months, and I wish you strength as you are all grappling with the illness and this pandemic has foisted upon us. For you to be able to be here today, we are grateful for your health. At Mandela University and across the higher education sector, which I represent, we have not been spared by the losses of our colleagues and our students. The most recently for us and painful one has been the loss of our colleague, Professor Lungile Pepeta, who was the Executive Dean of Health Sciences and the champion of the preventative measures against the COVID-19 incidentally. So we're still reeling, as you all know, that we had to postpone this colloquium in order to pay respect to the passing of our colleague. When I read the theme of this colloquium, I was captivated by Inyathi ibuzwa kwabaphambili. Siphokazi has already mentioned what does this mean. This theme is extremely significant as it deliberately seeks to recognize the generational continuities and discontinuities of the struggle and achievements by women today. Our discussion over the next 2 days are a contribution to the righting the wrongs of excluding women's historiographies that have fundamentally shaped ideas and of personhood, liberation and leadership, yet are largely left out of history, thus altering the narrative and how our common journey as human being is being told. Inyathi ibuzwa kwabaphambili is a call to action for us to look back while we are building and moving forward, learning from our elders, our grandmothers, those who have built the institutions before us, those who have sacrificed so much for so many of us, and for those who are yet to be born. This connection and recognition of the linkages of the history and future of women enables us to recognize the continuities within the challenges faced by women today. It is through these intergenerational conversations in spaces such as this one that we must begin to transmit, share, and archive the struggles, celebrations, and achievements by women from different generations. In South Africa, the Women's Day, August 9, commemorates the 1956 Women's March, when women rose up to reject the carrying of a racially discriminatory identity document known as the passbook, or known as Dom Pass, which some of us have carried in the past. This anti-pass campaign,
if you can just fill up.
This anti-pass campaign saw more than 22,000 women across race and class unite against the harassment and onslaught by the apartheid state of the time in its brutal attempt to enforce racial segregation. Whilst we celebrate, we must not forget the 1913 Free State anti-pass campaigns to defy the Union of South Africa state by not carrying passes and refusing to buy permits. Reflect for a minute and imagine the abilities of women like Katie Law, who managed to gather 5,000 signatures against the pass laws at a time when there was no social media or an effective transport system. When we talk about intergenerational linkages, we also need to remember women, for example, like Nokuthela Dube, who studied music in Brooklyn in New York in 1896. Through her international music performance, she would later help to pay for the establishment, together with her husband, John Langalibalele Dube, of the Ohlange Institute, the first education institution for Africans established by Africans. Coming from that region myself, I know very well that this work has been more associated with her husband than with herself. So this project should seek to correct those mistakes. She was also one of the co-founders of Ilanga Lasenatal in 1903, the first isiZulu newspaper. This colloquium is encouraging us to revisit histories such as these, to learn from different generations' tactics and leadership in how to fight injustice of any type in our society while we build strong and lasting institutions. I wish to challenge us colleagues that as we learn from the elders, we deliberately position the everyday struggles of ordinary women at the center of the conversation, allowing recognition as intellectuals in their own right. I've mentioned to Dr. Mapkokwana quite recently that a number of women that do not get recognized and foregrounded are the ones that do not have a written contribution, that have never stood on the podium, but who lead quietly in communities reproducing humanity. We need to capture those stories in the medium that is accessible to all our publics. There is also an urgent need for theorizing models that recognize women's socioeconomic contributions. The economic daily survival strategies of the women and young people of this continent must be recognized for the complex ecosystems that they are, fundamental to both the social fabric and real needs such as the education for the young people paid for through organic economic systems such as stock fairs, imigalelo as we know them, and burial societies called omasingcwabisane. We also cannot forget the crushing, continuing violence in our society, which is central to the intergenerational traumas that are faced by many women of all ages today. It is critical that we center these daily struggles while we are forging new ways that will protect the future generations from this crippling violence. This colloquium takes seriously the threats of knowledge which have been largely marginalized in both public culture and in the academy. Over the next 2 days, I hope we will add to a broader feminist archival project which seeks to remember women and to displace erasure of their intellectual contributions in the political and cultural imaginations in Southern Africa. The proceeding will contribute also, it is my hope, to a publication which is anticipated, highly anticipated, which is potentially the first of its kind. The colleagues that I mentioned who are headlining this event are the colleagues that are going to be headlining and putting together this publication. This material will be written by these women, centering the lives and ideas of the women whose ideas, actions, and creativity is not often located within the broader contestations of their time, and it is done with their male counterparts, with whom many shared spaces and ideas. The publication is an offering in rereading and knowledge that flows from our mothers, seeking to destabilize the gender inequalities in the world knowledge production globally. It hopes to inspire future publications which will further develop and excavate how women have been shaped, fashioned, and contested in various African intellectual traditions. It aims to show the threats and the continued struggles which were established in the 1600s and continue to this day into the 2000s. This work is being undertaken, as I've said, by academics here at Nelson Mandela University, at Rhodes University, and at the University of Pretoria, in conversation with other feminists. I wish to acknowledge these groundbreaking initiatives, colleagues. I wish to recognize and thank all the colleagues who are at the forefront of this project, as I have mentioned them. I thank all of you for taking time to participate in this colloquium. This colloquium, I have to say, is an important contribution to our intentions here at Mandela University to revitalize the humanities, and in so doing, center the greater humanity in our academic enterprise through our engagement, our learning and teaching, and research and innovation. Your wisdoms will contribute greatly to this endeavor. So I thank you very much. Again, I hope you enjoy the colloquium, and I hope that the inter-institutional collaboration that we see through the work of the center will continue. I thank you very much, and I wish you the very best in the next 2 days. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you so much to Prof. Sibongile Mutwa, the Vice Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University. Colleagues, I'm now going to give the platform to Dr. Babalwa Makwaqwana, who is going to then introduce Dr. Musa Wenkosi Saurumbe from the Charlotte Maxeke Institute, as well as our keynote speaker, Dr. Brigalia Bam. Dr. Babalwa Makwaqwana is, of course, the interim director of the Center for Women and Gender Studies. She's also a senior lecturer in the Sociology and Anthropology Department at the Nelson Mandela University. Dr. Babalwa Makwaqwana. Just a second, colleagues, as I try to get Dr. Babalwa Makwaqwana on the platform.
Afternoon, colleagues. As you can see that I've been struggling with the technology from my side, but it's a great honor to be here today, thanks to the leadership of this African Dynamic University, represented today by the Chancellor, Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Muleketi, the Council Chair, Ambassador Nozipho January Patel, the Vice Chancellor, who have just opened for us, Professor Sibongile Mutwa, and all the DVCs, Mr. Lebohang Ashatse, Professor Cheryl Foxcroft, and the Acting DVC for Transformation and Engagement, Professor Kiet, who is mostly entertaining our dreams in the Center for Women and Gender Studies. I'd also like to greet the university heads, heads of entities, deans, directors, our partners at Rhodes University, Dr. Sibongile Sipokazi Magadla, and Atambile Masola from the University of Pretoria. The Center for Women and Gender Studies team, Professor Pumla Qola, Nomtamenye Sipokazi Tau, Yandisa Jubase, Wendy Adams, Tembi Butelezi, who was our graphic designer, and the marketing and communications team that has been helping us. To our university SRC members, our community members, friends of the center, and the broader public that is watching us from all different social media platforms. Molweni, good afternoon. Before I introduce our two speakers this afternoon, Vice Chancellor, please allow me to speak to the theme of the colloquium just for 2 minutes. This theme seeks to center the intergenerational conversation, as the VC has just spoken, and recognize the interdependence of one generation to the other. When we themed the conference, we were deliberate about using seniority in the conception of what is knowledge, how we know what we know, and who is the producer of knowledge. It is through our grandmothers, Omakulu, our aunts, Rahadi, Omakadzi, our mothers that have shaped our intellectual foundations of knowledge. This knowledge is sometimes neglected, invisibilized, and disregarded by the patriarchal society and by extension, the academy. They seek to create a sense of shame and non-belonging to the younger generation who are part of it today. It is fitting to acknowledge these maternal contributions from our elders, the status that all of us cannot escape, as this is intertwined with our impatient youthfulness in thinking that we are far better and more progressive than the generation that came before us. It is the combination of seniority, youthfulness, and the zeal for change that brought us here today. And we hope these intergenerational conversations shall energize and spark debates about the status of women, young people, the queer communities, and the broader marginalized Black populations all over the world. Through this theme, we believed that it is time to take stock, celebrate, engage, and critically evaluate the history of knowledge through the lives of women who have been mostly invisibilized, misread, and deliberately forgotten. We are here to announce that, as Umama Lillian Ngoyi did in 1956, when she said, and I quote, "The daughters of Africa are here. They built this place. Their husbands died for this," close quote. And I want to add to this and say, and the younger women carrying their mothers' histories, victories, and traumas are here today also to revisit, recount, dignify, critically engage their legacies, study their leadership tactics, archive their presence in history, and most importantly, to continue building institutions that will uphold the values of Ubuntu, welcome difference, celebrate centering of African thought, and respect women's rights while defending the broader democratic values of our country. It is through the seminal archival work of Black women scholars like Tozama April, who is part of the panelists today, and later the anti-apartheid activist Zubeida Jaffa, who have helped us to learn and expose Matlake's mind and her works and contributions in the political liberation and education of this country. The Center for Women and Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University has prioritized this archival project of women's histories to conscientize our society and remember the leadership tactics while studying the maternal legacies that brought us here today. To speak from the family of Mama Charlotte Manya Matleke, as the ambassador of the Charlotte Matleke Institute, Dr. Seraumbe Musawengosi is here today. She became the first youngest female PhD graduate in Africa at the age of 23 in 2017 from the Northwest University, specializing in industrial psychology in the field of talent value proposition in the higher education. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Free State in Bloemfontein. She has published academic research articles in several accredited scientific journals, both nationally and internationally, In 2017, Dr. Saraumbe received the Best Doctoral Student in South Africa Award and was recognized as the Emerging Psychologist of the Year by Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology of South Africa. Please, colleagues, let me help me to welcome Dr. Musa Wengosi Saraumbe from Charlotte Maxeke Institute. Over to you, Musa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babalwa. I greet everyone on this platform and thank you for that warm welcome. And since I have a very limited time, allow me to acknowledge Madam VC, the DVCs, the deans, and all the leadership of the institutions represented here today. And just to acknowledge also all the attendees, the organizers, all protocol observed. Now, I am representing, as has been mentioned, the Charlotte Maxeke Institute, and I am an ambassador of this institute. Now, the significance, of course, of Charlotte, as has already been alluded to, is the pioneering role, the groundbreaking role that she played in terms of the advancement of emancipation of women and the contribution that women have been making, although undermined and under-acknowledged, especially in the past. So it's important for us to take note of these contributions that have been made and how this has been a foundation laid for those of us who are currently continuing with the mandate already established previously, and how important it is for us to carry on the work that was long started. Now, I just want to give an outline of the work that we do at the Charlotte Maxeke Institute. Now, of course, this institute has been founded or was founded by the great-grandchildren of Charlotte, and also the great-grandchildren of her sister, Mam Katie Makanya, who got married into the Makanya family, previously being, of course, Amanya. Now, it's our duty and our mandate to ensure that her work continues in today's generation and to use her story as a torch in solving today's challenges. And so one of the things that really stands out right now is the countdown to 2021, where she would have been 150 years old. So this is a milestone that we find befitting to celebrate. And so we are highlighting the work that she was a part of and the work that she made a contribution to. And we are fully supported by the National Heritage Council especially. And we'd like to acknowledge as well all our partners in this. Now, one of Charlotte's most profound quotes was where she said, this work is not for yourselves. Kill that spirit of self and do not live above your people, but live with them. And if you can rise, bring someone with you. And so from the work that she established and pioneered, we continue to see even a Charlotte in each of us today, in the women that are currently carrying on the torch that she passed on to us. And so we are currently facing unprecedented times, of course, of the coronavirus that has ravaged, the global setting. And beyond that, we've also unfortunately had to deal with gender-based violence as another pandemic, if not even greater than the coronavirus itself. And this is very disheartening, and all of us need to take a stand against gender-based violence and the violence that has been taking place against the women in our country. Now, it's also important for us to acknowledge Charlotte on all the work that obviously she started out that we are carrying on. And so as the CMMI in July, of course, we were a bit thrown off by COVID, and we quickly found our feet and managed to organize events through platforms such as this one. And as we can all acknowledge that we're getting accustomed to what we call the new normal. And so we've been able to catch up on our events this year, and obviously culminating to the 2021 milestone of our 150th year celebration. And so in July, there were dialogues that were conducted, that is online meetings of minds and, young minds that were exchanging ideas and basically interacting in conversation and dialogue to highlight socioeconomic realities in this country. And then this month, the month of August, where women are acknowledged, although we need to be acknowledged and appreciated every other month, obviously, but we're still working on that. And in August, this was supposed to be the month where, we have an annual, as the CMMI, there's an annual award ceremony where women who are doing great things in their different fields and facets are acknowledged. Unfortunately, due to logistical issues, it had to be postponed. So that will take place next week in the first week of September. Now, we also have in September as well, of course, that being Heritage Month, a journey that we're going to take all, our stakeholders and all those involved in the CMMI's work through the trail of her legacy and how, the time leading from her birth all through her life and all the way up to after death. And even now, her work continues to speak. Now, also, there will be a launch, the call in creating the Charlotte Manyamatleke in me. So like I've already mentioned, all of us as young women and women in general have a Charlotte in us. And so it's important for us to acknowledge this. And so we invite students, achievers, community members, leaders in various sectors to join in the voice across the continent and the globe to write 150 words that depict the value of Mom Charlotte that they would like to emulate. So this is basically in a nutshell the things that the programs that we're working on. And as I mentioned when I started, I have very limited time. And so I just solicit the support of everyone here, those who believe in and are inspired by the legacy of Mom Charlotte, to play a role in whatever way you can to make a contribution. And if you can rise, bring someone with you. Thank you very much for your audience.
Thank you so much, Musa. We really appreciate that beautiful, detailed also plans to celebrate Umama Charlotte Maxeke by the Institute. Colleagues, friends, I'm sure you agree that at 87 years of age, to converse with people via Zoom, living under severe restrictions as part of the vulnerable group to the pandemic COVID-19, Dr. Brigalia Hlophe Bam, Umakhulu Hlophe, is the testament to commitment to women's leadership histories, resilience, and dynamism. She was born in 1933 here in the Eastern Cape, in the village called KwaGoqwana in the former Transkei. She studied social work, practiced as a teacher in the early career almost 40 years ago. Dr. Bam is a prominent gender activist, a passionate developer of young women. She is a former chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission, IEC, and we can dare say the face of such an institution to date. She is a former General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches, Program Director of the World Council of Churches in Switzerland for almost 21 years. She has been awarded numerous international awards, including Mahatma Gandhi International Award for Peace and Reconciliation, O.R. Tambo Lifetime Achiever Award, Ubuntu Award, and most importantly, the Order of Boab, Silver in 2014 by the presidency, to honor him for the dedication to women's development and recognition of her work to build democratic institutions in South Africa. She is a former chancellor of Walter Sisulu University. She has received more than 5 honorary doctorates locally and internationally. I think one of her most important roles was that she was the chancellor of the then University of Port Elizabeth, which has become Nelson Mandela University today. She is a former research professor at the chair in electoral democracy in Africa at UNISA. She has written her own book titled Democracy, More Than Just Elections. She has contributed several articles, journal articles, book chapters on issues including women's perspectives, liberation, development, democracy, among many other issues. In 2005, our very own university also honored Mambam with an honorary doctorate for her service to women of this continent and her contributions in building South African democracy. Colleagues, friends, students, community members, help me to welcome Dr. Brigalia Hlophe Bam to speak on celebrating African women's intellectual histories. Charlotte Manyamakleke. Mam Hlophe, siza kuwe ke ngoku. Enkosi.
It's nodding. Okay. Thank you very much. You will not be too surprised that there is a little delay. That is to be expected because technology has taken over my old life. I hope you can all hear me. Oh, good. Yeah, fine. Okay, I hope I'm there now with the assistance of my daughter colleague. I hope you can all hear me.
We can hear you, Mam Hlophe.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Yes, I'm being assisted with all this very modern technology. Program Director, Vice Chancellor, there are just so very many of the people I am proud of in this group. I don't know where to begin. I can safely say all of you, wherever you are a great pride in my life. I must first express my very deep gratitude of being invited to be with you today and to be part of what I refer to as one of the most important events. Indeed, it is an honor for me, but it is also an honor for many women of my generation, your grandmothers, your great-grandmothers, who have been on this road, very long road for many, many years. I'd like to first and foremost commend you for this inter-university collaborative arrangement, as this ought to be a model for future collaboration as a mission to emancipate women. It needs to be transdisciplinary, and it must cross across all the boundaries of our various institutions. I need to add that many, many years ago, maybe 40 years ago, a colleague of mine, Dr. Odioye of Ghana, experimented on this model. And I want to assure you, it will work for you because it has found its time and it has found its people who are committed to working together. We have all learned that if we do not work in partnerships, if we do not learn to complement each other and work in a collaborative way, we cannot be able in the world we are facing today to be successful. I've lived long enough, I can assure you, to know that collaboration and partnerships are a story of success in our world today. Let me also reveal my modest approach to this, since I refer to myself as a living ancestor, representing other living ancestors, is that I'm not really going to pretend that I can present to you scholars anything that is going to reveal great magic. But instead, I figuratively invite you to a table that I can already see it is really set with the comments that have been made before I speak. I figuratively invite you, as I said, to break this bread together in our quest for women emancipation. At my advanced age, I am engaged in a dialogue, as it is today, with posterity, hoping that we are indeed, and we have indeed, passed the torch to you. As we gather in this virtual platform today, marking 65 years of this famous group of women, many more of them, and I want to make a comment to say that I hope the research that has been attempted to find more of these women and find more of their stories will be successful. For now, we have very few names of these women who are being celebrated. And yet we do know that there were many more of them who were part of that. We're doing this at a very difficult time, you know, as the world in which we are in is faced with global calamities, both global as well as national. What we are facing now is something unknown to the world. It has not only affected every part of us in every population, but it has also affected the lives of women in many ways. As we look around, as we read around, talking about the health of women, social and economic consequences. In South Africa, the scale, the gruesomeness and impact of gender-based violence, which has been mentioned already, is unprecedented. Even though on paper, we're supposed to have some of the most progressive laws and constitution. The rampant corruption, rapidly declining economy, growing inequalities, intergenerational poverty, the poverty of women in this country is amazing. Unemployment, human trafficking, and many other social ills, which are already affecting women today in a very devastating intensity. I'm pointing out these to lay the intellectual canvas on which our discourse should be grounded, as well as place historically responsibility on us as agents of change. And we are talking of the social justice. That's where the emphasis of our thinking is today. A great African scholar, I'm sure, whom I have had a chance to know of in my early days, and an activist, Frantz Fanon, whom you all have read about in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, when he proclaimed, and that is the message to all of us and to you in particular, that each generation, I quote, must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. It was at the close of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century that Charlotte Manyamaxeke, we are talking of today, took a stand to define their mission and became a distinguished pioneer and pathfinder for women's emancipation when it was almost unthinkable and when odds were massively against the very concept of social justice for women. The context may have vastly different then, but the underlying issues which permeate our society today, despite enlightened policies and the programs that we have, the journey is a long journey. The journey of liberation is a long journey. And I do want to publicly also congratulate the Institute of the work that we have just been told that it is doing. She is indeed, will remain so, one of our greatest ancestors. I have lived in this world for more than 8 decades, as you have already heard. And as you had a part of my CV read, it's been a journey of challenge where I have been involved, as you know, in many organizations. But I want to particularly mention my childhood, because I think that is a time that is important, that has to be looked at by many researchers. The childhood of many of us, of my generation, and even before my generation. And that is our mothers who, where I grew up, belonged at that time already to an organization in the Eastern Cape that was called Zenzele Organization. This organization was in operation already in the 40s and late 30s. And there were the women in this organization already taking the responsibility of taking care not only of their homes, not only of supporting their husbands, but in their own right, they were producing food. In their own right, they were the people who were there for the values of society, and they were there, the anchor at that time of society. It is not something new that people talk of the values of today that many people talk about. Yes, they have always been the values that these women and mothers made sure that many of us would get education. They were committed to the fear of God. They were committed to Ubuntu. They were committed to sharing what they had. There were indeed many of them what would be referred today as activists, community activists. And this was no great effort to them to be able to support people in their communities and care for them, and care also for the young people of their communities. And so today it is this wonderful seminar, which I like very much, Inyathi Ibuzwa Phambili, which already has been described, that it opens the challenges to young people to begin to look back, which you have so articulated very well, as to what happened before they were there. And to continue with all that, the intergenerational, which already has its own values that you have seen, and to say that as we reinforce each other with this dialogue, share experience, and use what I call a botanical term to cross-pollinate, so that the flowers of our revolution can blossom for the coming seasons. As women and scholars of this generation seek answers, research agenda, and programs of interventions, I hope you have a brutal, honest, and difficult conversation informed by the following. Why have some of our interventions to emancipate women failed? Of course, I know you will talk about the successful ones, but that's no question. What questions have we failed to ask? What have been our blind spots in the embrace of mainstream literature on women's issues with a fast changing societal and global context? What should be our new responsive research agenda? The role played, yes, by pioneering women, which some of you have articulated for well, is well known. But there are already women who were there in the liberation struggle, pre-colonial time and the colonial time itself. Our women's history has played a very decisive role. into what today we call this so-called modern South Africa, if that is the terminology we use. As we examine women intellectual history, we very often have a blind spot of exclusively looking at icon and at celebrated figures in history and forget the vast wealth of intellectual histories of ordinary women in our families, which I have referred to, the women in our communities that they have played in our formative years, which I have made reference to. Our examination of women's intellectual history should be revisited again so that we can talk about our grandmothers, our aunts, and our sisters who shaped, as I said, with the values that today are very important for us to restore in our societies. It is in minding this intellectual history that we will be closer to comprehend and apprehend the organic experiences of women, thus being able to come up with future research agenda and focal points for our intellectual endeavors on the subject of women and gender studies. I hope my talk and experience and the many of the conversation that is going to follow is going to be able to contribute to the new thinking that is coming on how we look at feminism today. When I make that comment, Program Director, I am not implying that the debates that have been going on in the Western world and the debates that have gone on with many scholars in the world are not important, have not made a contribution to the long journey of emancipation. But I think there is a new demand in which, in the globalization of the world, as we are talk about the new technology, as we talk about the influence of the computers, which people say is fundamentally going to change the lives of people. Yes, it is going to change the way we do things. But we need to think very seriously, and I refer it to you. Of course, I use we. I know that I'm part of your collective for now. Is that the condition of women and the gender relations need to be looked at very, very much. Because we are not sure, some of us of the older generation, that in fact, this new technology and the new world is going to change the life of women. You talk of the fourth industrial revolution, yes, which I think everyone is looking up to, the internet things that are there to change our lives. But we must fully grasp what these are going to mean to the world of inequalities and the digital divide. How these impact on young girls and on old women. What do these mean to the village woman? What do they mean also to an urban woman who is not privileged, who is not middle class, who doesn't have all the skills that are needed and the education that is needed? There are other mega trends shaping the world today and therefore impacting on women today, on refugee women today, on human trafficking, on frequency of epidemics and pandemics as we are experiencing, the environmental degradation and climate change, the rapid urbanization that is happening not only in our own country, but in other countries, the rise and the increase of the single woman-headed families and the households, and the urban-rural divide. All these need to be at the center of your research, maybe I should say of our research agenda. It is my submission that if we put together our efforts to economic emancipation of women through good contextually relevant education, agriculture, and rural development, and rebuilding of communities with women playing a central role will go a long way in ensuring sustained social justice for women. It is how, with what resources and social interventions that our research agenda should resolve on. While we must confront the urgent crisis of gender-based violence, we must not lose focus of sustainable solutions of economic and social emancipation of women in order to break the backbone of patriarchy. The life of Charlotte Maxeke is a testimony of a leader and a cohort of leaders who were organically embedded within communities they represented and worked for. It is the alienation of our leaders, all of us, including myself, and public intellectuals today that has created a social distance between ordinary women and public policy and research agenda for women emancipation. There must be an articulation between the two if we are to have a catalytic impact to the world of today. We must also learn, and I should say to you, as I said in the beginning, was learn very much of the mistakes of the past and see how we have been able in the past, with all the limitations of the past, we were able to cut across the women's issues so that women's issues are not only issues of middle-class women, urbanized women, women with education, and we have to find a way, what I refer to as undercutting women's solidarity. That is intersectionality in its approach. And so by that, we are talking of us not, yes, it's important for us to fight for positions. We have done that all our lives. It is important for us also to fight for fairness in the societies in which we live, and the inclusion of our ideas, the inclusions of our thoughts, the inclusion of our ideas and wisdom, the inclusion of our scholarly work. The list is very long. That will remain a struggle for a long time. But to bear in mind that for the new world that women are seeking, it has got to be intersectionally in its approach. And I am not saying that this has not happened before. I'm sure see it as a way in which is almost a demand to the researchers of today and to the women who have a privilege of having been to school and studied. As we ponder on how we ground our research agenda on real challenges of today, I invoke Charlotte Maxeke's famous and yet pointed quote, which I say, this work is not for yourselves, kill that spirit of self, and do not live above your people, but live with them. If you can rise, bring someone with you, I close quote. This is my appeal to you to rise above narrow academic career aspirations into activist scholars embedded within communities you reflect on. To rise above the artificial inhibitive disciplinary boundaries to search for the true meaning of condition of women without the shackles of academic enclaves. To rise above the partisan confinements and forge real solidarity for genuine, sustained women's emancipation and social justice. People and activist women of my generation have traversed this road and played our part within the confines of our historical moments. We now hand over the baton to current and future generations to continue with the struggle, knowing that for as long as women are denied social justice, humanity cannot fully realize its potential. Don't look any further. You are the leaders you have been looking for. You are the leaders yourself. If not you, who will do it? There is no way in which today women can sit and wait for the government and the government to do this and do that. If not now for you, when will it be done? If not here, where will it be done? And as I think of the many women in the world today, our daughters, our granddaughters, and the challenges they face, I say to them, because that's what has been a strong foundation, is that we keep focus, we keep on the journey, and we learn to support each other, and we learn to respect each other. Semkinkomo magwalandi. That is an expression that is used very much in the language that says, if you do not, as women today, pick up whatever you pick up, don't pick up sticks because you will want to fight a war, but pick up yourselves, your brains, and your souls, and you will save this world in which we live. Not only save the South Africa, but save the better world in which God has given us. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Brigalia Bam. Let me just, there we go. Thank you, colleague, for muting Dr. Brigalia's mic. There we go. All right, thank you so much, Doc. And Dr. Brigalia just reminding us there about how our work needs to center women who are often forgotten when we theorize women and when we talk about intellectual histories, women within our communities, our grandmothers, and particularly challenging us to ensure that all this work that we do is critical and it centers intersectionality to ensure that some women are not excluded from what she calls, we do not undercut women's solidarity. Thank you so much, Mamu Brigalia, for that. All right, colleagues, what I'm going to do now is to just allow a video of Tongues of Their Mothers by uMakhosazana Xaba to play as we just make way for our first panel discussion, which will be led by Dr. Atambile Masola. Earlier on, as we started the session, we played Africa by Salif Keif. So right now, I'd like to just put on our video, Tongues of Their Mothers by uMakhosazana Xaba.
Tongues of Their Mothers. I wish to write an epic poem about Sarah Baartman, one that will be silent on her capturers, torturers, and demolishers. It will say nothing of the experiments, the laboratories, and the displays, or even the diplomatic dabbles that brought her remains home eventually. This poem will sing of the Gamtoos Valley holding imprints of her baby steps. It will contain rhymes about the games she played as a child. Stanzas will have names of her friends, her family, her community. It will borrow from every single poem ever written about her, conjuring up her wholeness, her voice, dreams, emotions, and thoughts. I wish to write an epic poem about uMkabayi kaJama Zulu, one that will be silent on her nephew, Shaka, and her brother, Senzangakhona. It will not even mention Nandi. It will focus on her relationship with her sisters, Mawa and Mama, her choice not to marry, her preference not to have children, and her power as a ruler. It will speak of her assortment of battle strategies and her charisma as a leader. It will render a compilation of all the pieces of advice she gave to men of Abaqulusi who bowed to receive them, smiled to thank her, but in public never acknowledged her, instead called her a mad witch. I wish to write an epic poem about Daisy Makiwane, one that will be silent on her father, the Reverend Elijah. It will focus on her relationship with her sister, Cecilia, and the conversations they had in the privacy of the night, how they planned to make history and defy convention. It will speak the language of algebra, geometry, and trigonometry. Then switch to news, reports, reviews, and editorials. It will enmesh the logic of numbers with a passion that springs from words, capturing her unique brand of pioneer for whom the country was not yet ready. I wish to write an epic poem about Princess Magogo Constance Zulu, one that will be silent on her son, Gaja Mangosuthu Buthelezi. It will focus on her music and the poetry in it, the romance and the voice that carried it through to us. It will describe the dexterity of her music-making fingers and the rhythm of her body, grounded on valleys, mountains, and musical rivers of the land of AmaZulu. I will find words to embrace the power of her love songs that gave women dreams and fantasies to wake up and hold on to, and a language of love in the dialect of their own mothers. I wish to write an epic poem about Victoria Mxenge, one that will be silent on her husband, Griffiths. It will focus on her choice to flee from patients, bedpans, and doctors. This poem will flee from the pages and find a home in the sky. It will float below the clouds, automatically changing fonts and sizes and translating itself into languages that match each reader. It is a poem that will remind the people of Qonce that her umbilical cord fertilized their soil. It will remind the people of Umlazi that her blood fertilized their soil. It will remind her killers that we shall never, ever forget. I wish to write an epic poem about Nomvula Glenrose Mbata, one that will be silent on my father, her husband, Reuben Benjamin Xaba. It will focus on her spirit, one that refused to fall to pieces, rekindling the fire she made from ashes no one was prepared to gather. This poem will raise the departed of Magogo, Ngutu, Mkungundlovana, Inanda, Hilltown, Utrecht, Kwampande, Ndaleni, and Ashdown, so that they can sit around it as it glows and warm their hands, while they marvel at the fire she made from ashes no one was prepared to gather. These are just some of the epic poems I wish to write about women of our world in the tongues of their mothers. I will present the women in forms that match their foundations, using metaphors of moments that defined their beings and similes that flow through our seasons of eternity. But I am not yet ready to write these poems. My name is Makosazana Xaba.
All right, thank you so much for that. That poem was also, the video of that poem was created by the Asnakuthula Collective as well. All right, colleagues, I'm going to bring up Dr. Atambile Masola, just a brief bio. Dr. Masola is a writer, researcher, and teacher at the University of Pretoria. She has a PhD from the university currently known as Rhodes, which focuses on Black women's historiography, the intellectual histories, and life writing. She is the founder of Asnakuthula Collective, which is a group of teachers and researchers who aim to challenge the continued marginalization of women's narratives in the school curriculum, as well as hosting the Mqweto annual lecture. All right, Dr. Masola?
Hello, thank you so much, Gazi, for that introduction. My job is really small, and perhaps I should start off by saying thank you to Mamu Pregalia Bam for that wonderful, wonderful speech. And I was so moved when you ended with the idea of Zemkingo Mama Kwalandini, and really an encouraging note for us to start this colloquium and this project on. So I really, really am grateful for that. So my job, it is simply to facilitate a session of all my favorite people. And while they tell us all these wonderful and amazing, share their ideas about wonderful and amazing women. So the way that it's going to work, I'm going to introduce each speaker one by one, and I'm going to hand over to each speaker. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Nomatamsan Matisani, who is going to speak to us about a fortuitous appearance in history of the enigmatic Nosuthu Mamchawe Jodelo, a 19th century isiXhosa speaking woman. Dr. Tisane is a retired academic from Rhodes University and the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. And I love the fact that she calls herself an undisciplined academic. Over to you, Mam Tisane.
Hi there. Do I appear? Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Mama siyakubona, siyakuva.
I don't want to complain about this technology because I don't know how we would have survived without it in this pandemic. I wish to thank you for the honor that you have given me inviting me to this very auspicious gathering. But above all, I want to salute all the leaders who are gathered here, who I never thought I would share space with. My topic is convoluted, I agree, but I promise to unravel it as I go through the about 10 slides that I've made, which I hope that they would help me keep to my time of 15 minutes. My assistant here is helping me with a fortuitous appearance of the enigmatic Nosuthu in history, the enigmatic Makulu Nosuthu in history. Looking for women in history is like the proverbial search for a needle in a haystack, because women in history, but it is our time to bring our grandmothers, Omakulu, our mothers, and ourselves back to the story of humanity. The story of humanity is incomplete without women, and it is our duty to do that. I propose in this paper that the overarching task that we need to embark on is toppling the great chain of being. This is a European medieval thinking that claimed that humanity is put on a ladder, and the top, at the top is God, and below God is a white male, and at the lowest rung of this ladder is the indigenous or African woman. And it is this that I say we must topple once and for all. And in so doing, we shall be restoring and affirming the epistemic rights of African and indigenous women all over. I know this is a long haul. This is going to be a long haul. It's been 500 years since this thesis informed the world, and perhaps it may have 500 years, but a beginning has got to be made. And today marks the beginning. And the tools and the frameworks that we are going to be using are based on what Mudimbe claims to be African gnosis and Adesina calls endogeneity. And this simply means that we should be looking at the African woman from where she is, from where she was born, from where she operates and how she operated before she was defined as being less than human. When we look at how women have been defined as being less than women, there is no better example than the one that has just been cited in the epic, and that is Sarah Bartman, who left home as a human and ended up in Paris as an animal. And this is the task we've got to undo. We have no one to undo it for us. We just have to do it. And therefore, I begin with profiling Makhuluma Mchawe noSuthu Jotel as a kind of a case study in this exercise. I begin by looking at her clan name, Zidugo, in order to understand her fully. And she comes from the house of Amandinde, who are an older house in Xhosa royalty. So she's Mamchawe. So she's a princess who has almost been forgotten. And I also pick who she is when I look at the Xhosa Royal Genealogical Table. Amandinde are of, when I sing their praise, then it's Tamagwini, Mandinde, of Kote, of Ndinde, of Ngonde, of Malna. Then she married into Amajwaha. Amajwaha are said to have been a family of import, mid-19th century attests to, and Jabavo in his book of 1953 also claims this point about Amajwaha and Amagcirha. So Makhuluma Mchawe noSuthu has a very high profile in her society at the time. But then why do I talk of a fortuitous appearance in missionary history? Is that the missionaries never saw African women as fully human. This will be surprising because they cultivated an image of themselves as people who had come to protect African women from brutality. So much that when Shaw came, he soon got a title of being Ikakalabafaz, the shield of women. But that was not the case. Missionaries did not recognize African women as fully human. They instead created an image of somebody who is brutalized. They created an image of a victim, and they created an image of somebody who needed to be saved. But then how did Makhulu Mamchawe appear in the missionary history? It was simply because there was a plan that the missionaries had to undertake. They had to change plan or strategy because of the slow progress they were making in converting Amaxhosa, among whom they were working. They felt that they needed to take young Africans into Europe, steep them into European lifestyle and bring them back. And so the eye fell on Mamchawe's son, Tio, and they had then to bring her in. It was only because they wanted to undertake a plan that she was brought in to ask her. And further on, they record that Mamchawe was compliant, and she simply said it was God's will that Tio was being asked to go overseas. But this response that Mamchawe is said to have given reminds me of the Magnificat, which is the response that Mary gave when the angel Gabriel invited her. So even then, Mamchawe is being modeled against another Christian figure, not as she is. But Mamchawe, we will see that she actually is an enigmatic Nosutu. And I call her enigmatic in the sense that we cannot fathom her. We cannot fully comprehend her actions. She is mysterious, and perhaps because she had the agency that she was not expected to have then. Perhaps because she undertook choices that she did then. And the first thing that she did was, when she had contact with missionaries, was to have her son, her eldest son, Festiri, going to school and attending school. And no sooner had Festiri picked up basic reading and writing that he went back to the homestead. And he, Festiri, and Makhulu Nosutu built a school there, and Makhulu Nosutu and Festiri's siblings and the children in the locality attended school under Festiri. Festiri would have had about 3 years of schooling when he became not only a founder of a school, but a principal, with the help of Makhulu, of course. And for me, I say we celebrate homeschooling under Makhulu Nosutu long before we had the pandemic. Then she decided to convert, join them and baptize, and this happened in 1843. And what is even more difficult to understand is when she, Makhulu Nosutu, took one of her sons, Tio, and moved into the mission station, leaving Datu Soga, to whom he was married, and other children back at home. When I asked one of my students who I was teaching, what would you have done if your wife did this to you? He said, with such a sulk in his face, I would have gone to fetch my son. But I want to say, Soga never went to fetch Nosutu because he had decided on. The question that intrigues me, does this show the rights that women enjoyed during the 19th century, which they have since lost in the 21st century? This puzzles me. The fact that she could take a choice that she did, even establishing a school in a homestead. I don't think I'd be able to do that today, let alone taking a son and moving on to pick up. But perhaps we are not doing justice in looking at Makhulu Nosutu just from what the missionaries are saying. I would like us to focus on Hendinde's background. She is Mamchawe of India, I already said. I would like to link her with a character called Jan Chachu, who went to Bethelstorp at a young age. His father sent him to Bethelstorp in 1804. And so he was steeped into Christian and European thinking. and he became a knowledgeable interpreter, helping new missionaries establish their mission stations, helping politicians engage across the cultural and language divide. But what is better about Chachu was that he was a Bible translator, and not just Benny, who's celebrated as having been a father of isiXhosa, or Brownlee as being one of the first translators of the Bible. It is Jan Chachu that broke the ice, found words that could interpret the Christian gospel and the Christian teaching and the Christian discourse into isiXhosa. But above all, Chachu is the initiator of what I call indigenous theology. Because he did not, but he took these and interpreted them within the African thinking. And therefore, he is the father of African theology. He's the father of indigenous theology. Interestingly enough, Chachu was an international traveler because he spent 18 months in Britain in 1836 to 1838. And he interacted with politicians and church people and was able to elicit his own thoughts, his own philosophy. Now, why am I bringing Chachu in? It's because Chachu is malume to the Soga children. The Sogas did not just get knowledge of Christianity from Tsikana, as most writers who talk about Dio Soga will trace the roots of the Christian belief to Tsikana. No, the Sogas had their malume, and you need to understand African thinking system, the role of malume in an individual's life. And they were under this influence. And if you want to understand Soga's philosophy and theology, you've got to go back to Chachu. And if you want to understand Soga's philosophy and theology, you've got to go back to his mother, Makulu Mamchawe. And if you want to go back to the great Soga learning tradition, you've got to go back to Mamchawe. And therefore, Makulu Nosutu is the progenitor of Soga intellectual dynasty, which South Africa has benefited from for the past 1.5 centuries. The Sogas are renowned for their missionary tradition, for journalism, politics, education. You not heard of a Soga in your life, put your hand up. There he is. I hope I'm still. And I put Soga as the son, and I put Tause as the granddaughter, because I am saying Nosutu nguye owafukama isisoga and owasifukama sonke, because we are all benefactors of that. So Shange asks, Gubani unina waba bantwana? And I say, Umakulu Nosutu. So unosutu wafukama, chickens incubate. But humans, we use this concept ukufukama for those who nurture, who guide, who give birth to new people, but give birth to new ideas. And this is Makulu Nosutu. Thank you very much.
Yo, enkosi kakhulu Mamdisi. Ityeketye ityebile, andiyazi noma mandiyiqale ngaphi le nto sandoyithetha. Just to echo what Nomalanga has just said, I've never heard of Usoga being read in this way. So thank you so much for your contribution, and thank you so much. Uyiqale kakuhle wathi banqabe okwezinyo lenkukhu omama in history, and that's really such a powerful expression to lead us as we get going. Just a reminder, colleagues, you can also add questions, and we will have a round of questions after our speakers. So while speakers are speaking, you can make note in the chat section to hold off on some of the questions that we will have a round of questions later. Our next speaker is Dr. Yvette Abrams, And Dr. Yvette is going to be speaking about the relationship between theory and practice, what Sarah Brightman taught me. Dr. Abrams has published, I won't read her entire bio, but has published in international and local journals on gender equality, queer theory, and has worked for 5 years as the Commissioner of Gender Equality in Cape Town. Her current work is looking at Project 90, which is Project 90 by 2030, which focuses on food security, energy, and local government in the context of climate change, as well as research interests in the field of indigenous economic plants, especially as they speak to economic development and climate resilience and climate change and economics. So thank you so much, Yvette, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and may I say it's an honor to be included in this August company. I'm reminded of the mothers who went before me on whose shoulders I stand, and especially Sis Brigalia. It's a long time since we worked together in chapter 9s, but I remember the example that you showed, that progress is about plain hard work. It's about diligence. It's not just high lofty ideals, but daily practical work. And that was something that I was privileged to learn from you when you chaired the IEC, and it's something that I love taking forward. Yes, and an honor to everybody else who is present, all protocol observed. Yes, I'm speaking to you from New Jersey, where I'm nursing my partner who has not been well. So it's about 7:30 in the morning for me. But lovely to have this anchor at home and to know that I'm held by all of you while I journey in Babylon. My own personal intellectual history in relation to Auntie Sarah Bartman, who of course is an inspiration for all I do, started when I was 32. I was in Canada and read about her for the first time, which is really interesting, but stuff happens when it's supposed to happen. I mean, Desiree Lewis, for instance, at the time was already working on her, so it's really strange that I had to be in exile before coming across Auntie Sarah's story. And it gripped me because having grown up in exile myself, I could understand what it was like. And wrote at the time I was studying my master, wrote a short essay and then left it and went back to being a very respectable economic historian. Did my master's thesis on the historiography of Khoisan resistance and came back home fully intending to do a PhD on trading routes between Windhoek and Cape Town between 1890 to 1910. Like I said, nice, solid economic history. But Auntie Sarah wouldn't leave me alone. And in mid-1995, she just kept me awake with dreams, night after night for 3 nights. And eventually I went to my supervisor, the long-suffering Bill Naston, and said, look, I've got to change my thesis topic. I have to do this really wacko thesis topic on the intersectionality of race, class, and gender in the historiography of Sarah Bartman. And he was like, okay, amazing man. And that's what I did for the next 6 years. And what I started out wanting to do was to write a biography of Sarah Bartman in the way she would have written it. And what became the PhD thesis, the first 250 pages, was purely introductory. It was reading what other people had written about her through an intersectional lens. It was meant to be chapter 1, and by 250 pages, the department made me stop and submit it as a thesis. They were like, no, no more. And what I learned during those 5 years was that to write about Sarah Bartman in the way she would have written about herself actually meant not writing a book at all. It meant growing a garden. It meant resurrecting the 18th century ecosystem in which she lived. And that's what I did from 2005, 2006. Bought a plot, a hectare, and on that hectare, ever since then, it's now 15 years and counting, recreated the ecosystem, the ecology in which she lived. And I wrote about this in 2010, about nature's poetry, about nature's metaphor, about nature's grocery store as temple, as clothing shop, as home. And so to really do the task that she had laid before me, to really do that work, it led me out of academia altogether. And that's not at all strange for people who study indigenous knowledge systems. I mean, it's well known that IKS is not something that you can really truly do in academia as it's constituted today, because our view of the relationship between theory and practice is so fundamentally different. You know, African epistemology tends to very much not be binary. This whole notion that there is a clear distinction between theory and practice, and that one can do the one at a university and do the other in quote unquote real life, in itself isn't African. It just doesn't work like that. Our spirituality is expressed through very practical means. Mpepo, Mkronyani, the material circumstances of our lives is what our spirituality is embedded in, and vice versa. As for instance, Wangari Maathai has written about extensively, that as the ecosystem became destroyed and as we became complicit in the destruction of the ecosystem, one of the things that went with that was our spirituality and also our epistemology, our ontological approach to the world got destroyed as we assisted in chopping the trees and building railways. Now fine, a lot of times we did that under duress. I'm descended myself from ancestors who in 1907 lived in forced labor camps and were forced to build railways. So I'm not talking about the question of complicity. I'm just simply saying, in relation to the question of how theory relates to practice, our practice began to destroy the circumstances in which we could create theory. And so it should come as no surprise that I was literally forced to recreate an 18th century ecosystem in order to be able to recreate an 18th century ontology that would enable me to write the poem that was Sarah Bartman's life. The material practice had to lay the basis for the spiritual journey on which I was engaged. Fast forwarding to 2018, when I was hit on the head with a car and suffered concussion for 2 years, which turned out to be a blessing for me because it forced me to embrace my calling as a traditional healer, which if I had always had that very safe middle class escape of being able to be a highly paid research consultant, I might never have embraced in the way I did. But there was that ecosystem already. I became a street trader, occupied a piece of land in Krotoa's Gardens, and traded very happily until the global pandemic. And suddenly realized, oh, you are writing the story of Sarah Bartman's life in practice. You are taking the herbs of her childhood, the medicines of her life, the beauty of her spirit, the flowers and so on, and bringing that to use in changing the lives of women today, in making a material difference to women today, whether it's creating jobs within the business, whether it's opening up distributors, whether it's just simply healing women and their skin and enabling them to find a path back to themselves. And again, so my theory becomes practice. So the question of how do you decolonize is not for me a question that I can hold a workshop on or give a seminar. I have to create an authentic waxberry soap, which my people have made for about 6,000 years, and said, feel what your fin feels like when it is decolonized, when you understand on the molecular level what it is like to not be colonized, then you will free your mind to do other intellectual work. So that is how I've been led, and that is how I've been guided. And I think in conclusion, just to talk about the ancestral way of knowing as a third way of knowing, that is the epistemological journey which I've traveled, and that is where I am now. To say, yes, Africans, we do inductive logic like everybody else, we do deductive logic like everybody else, but we also have a third way of knowing. We are not guided purely by our own temporal beings, but we are guided by people who have gone before us, who know a heck of a lot more than we do. And I think my journey is such an excellent example of that, that I learned things directly through the spirit that I never learned through my PhD. And I guess the example I want to use is very mundane, but also very earth-shattering, namely face masks. In March, when I first, when the global pandemic hit South Africa, the ancestors were shouting their heads off, going, face masks, face masks, face masks. And I was like, there's not really any scientific evidence for that. I mean, there's no inductive or deductive logic for that. And they go, face mask. And again, literally couldn't sleep. And had huge arguments with the World Health Organization that was firmly against, recommending universal mask wearing and so on. And there was one small literature review, but there wasn't really much scientific evidence. But hey, the ancestors had spoken, and it's, pass the message on or not sleep. So I started promoting face masks on my Facebook page, through all my organizations, all my fellow traditional healers. And before we knew it, in the first 3 weeks of lockdown, South Africa's women had produced 55 million face masks. And now, particularly since mid-July, the scientific evidence is coming out to confirm why this one simple thing has saved countless lives. And certainly future research will show how the fact that our infection trajectory is starting to fall has a lot to do with the way the government has enforced universal mask wearing in South Africa. So the third way of knowing in my head is something, and to be quite honest, it's not the first time it's happened. There's many times when I pursued a conclusion and waited for the research to come up, and lo and behold, it comes. So I'm not trying to say that these ways of knowing are in opposition. I think inductive and deductive logic will eventually find its way to the third way of knowing, and at least that's been the journey of my life. But what makes us strong as Africans, I think, is to validate that way of knowing and to create pathways, channels of communication with sort of academically more established ways of knowing. So I guess in conclusion, what I would like to encourage all of you to do is to revise that historiographical trend. I mean, because the way most of us accessed education, particularly the early generations, as we saw in that brilliant preceding presentation, was through mission schools. And because of that, by definition, the third way of knowing has been neglected in many ways from the very beginning of our academic pursuits as African women. But taking this very practical example of saving lives, of changing the course of a global pandemic, saying we could do more to validate it, we could do more to establish ways to communicate between different ways of knowing. We could certainly do a lot more, not just to save lives, but to build a new system in which African women are strong and in which the third way of knowing is respected and revered as it should be. So on that note, once again, I'm so happy to be in this brilliant company, and I look forward to future discussion.
Thank you so much, Yvette. And I'm so glad you spoke about the garden, because this morning I woke up and decolonized my skin. I washed with some buchu and honey soap and put on some butter, and that is from Koi Life. So I feel the material difference of what you're speaking about as we talk. So thank you so much for joining us. I see there are some hands and queries about questions. Maputi, we're going to take questions right at the end, so make a note of that, and we're going to come back to questions right at the end, so just hold on to that, or you can just put them in the comment section for now. So our next speaker is going to be Dr. Tozama April. And the last time I saw Dr. Tozama April, we were sitting on a panel together with Professor Ndongela Masilela, who has since passed away. And it was such a refreshing session to just share that space with her. And she is going to be talking about pioneers of Black feminist thought in South Africa. Dr. April is a next generation scholar who writes on women and feminist historiography with a dissertation titled Theorizing Women, the Life of Charlotte Maxeke. Over to you, Dr. April. Is Dr. April with us? Yes, okay, I see you. Oh, Sisi, I can't hear you. Maybe take out your earphones. Sometimes it does that. Unplug your earphones if you can. As in, Spagazi, has she been unmuted? Please check. Jabasa?
I've just unmuted her.
Okay. Dr.
Dr.
April?
Tozama? I just want to ask Dr. Tozama, are you using a cell phone or a laptop?
Laptop.
Using a laptop, okay. Are your earphones out?
From the aux cable.
Okay. Perhaps we can see if we can't move to the next speaker while I try and just speak privately with Dr. Tozama.
Okay. We'll come back to Dr. Tozama, which means we'll go to you, Prof. Kola, who she and I were on a panel just last week. Oh, stop my video. Whoops. She and I were just on a seminar just last week, so it's really great to be back on this platform and in this colloquium together again. And she's going to be speaking about Miriam Tladi, Writing Freedom. We know that Prof. Kola is now part of the Center for Women and Gender Studies at the University of Nelson Mandela, but formerly has been a Dean of Research at the University of Fort Hare, a former HOD of African Literature Department at Wits University, and has been a full-time professor of African literature. Prof. Kola, over to you.
Good, is it still morning? Afternoon, Molweni. Good afternoon. I thank you very much, Atambile. It's always really good to see you. And thank you very much to all the colleagues who have spoken before me. I'm going to get right to it. In an interview published shortly after Miriam Tladi's fourth book, Footprints in the Quag, in 1989, Cecily Lockett asked the author, "Would you call yourself a feminist writer?" This is a question that confronted Tladi many times. One she answers with clarity in the affirmative. Yet, her feminism is interpreted as ambivalent in much scholarship on her work. Taking what she says in that interview seriously and noting how she constantly complicates her answer, I'm interested here, as part of a larger project, in rereading Miriam Tladi, paying attention to those parts of her work that have suffered critical neglect, and as a way of making three linked arguments on how we interpret the primary texts at the core of this paper. The first argument is for reading her as a feminist theorist of race and Black life, specifically. Second, Tladi theorizes race in polyvocal and multiple genres, insisting on writerly strategies that prioritize complexity as part of Black subjectivity. Third, this theorization of race and freedom writing project is discernible in all of Tladi's writing, but it is amplified and therefore not possible to read her non-fictional work and continue to miss it, which might explain the neglect of particularly that part of her work. It has been important, deliberately or by omission, for these parts of her oeuvre not to be read. When we read them, when we read her nonfiction, she leaks out of all the boundaries that determine how we understand her work, and equally her standing in South African letters. In response to the question by Lockett, Tladi underlines her feminism as highly cognizant of race and other indices of power and how these work and impact it. Her feminism is not the primacy of gender, but about patriarchy as structural, she insists. It is not the attitudinal sexism. It is not concerned with the attitudinal sexism of what she calls, quote, narrow Western feminisms. and perpetually collaborating with other institutional systems of power. Importantly, Tladi's feminism is not just a South African feminism, but it travels along what Carol Boyce Davis has theorized as migratory subjectivities that characterize radical Black women's writing in the 20th century, in conversation with other feminists in the world who are similarly concerned about interlocking forms of oppression. Here, Tladi mentions Flora Nwapa, the first woman novelist in Nigeria. In her own archival research on Audre Lorde, Danai Mubodza has discovered letters between Audre Lorde and Miriam Tladi, detailing their sometimes friendship. Finally, Tladi's impatience in her response to Locke is with the notion of patriarchy's inevitability, an impatience that is everywhere in her work, fiction, drama, essays, columns, play. Whereas other feminists in the Black consciousness tradition, like Rampele, have argued that men were blind to their misogyny, even as these feminists relentlessly and apologetically challenge these men. Tladi sees patriarchal investment as deliberate. Here, it is the suggestion that men willfully and consciously see and treat women in ways that most would not interpret and diminish their mothers that leads to this conclusion. For Tladi then, rather than a romanticization of mothering or even mother-son relationships, which is everywhere evident in the magazine Stuff Rider, where her columns appear at the expense of the figures of mothering characters, Tladi here positions subordination of women in writing strategies as well as in the material world beyond as willful. Whereas Tladi is known, even to those unfamiliar specifically with her work, as the first Black woman to publish a novel in English in South Africa, a mouthful. And it is important to continue to read Tladi's novels, Amandla and Mural at Metropolitan and Between Two Worlds, as well as her short stories. Much less attention is paid to Tladi's non-fictional work in the form of a substantial body of essays and columns. In the column specifically, Soweto Speaking in Stuff Rider magazine. In the longer version of this paper, which will be published in the book, I pay attention to various columns in the first 5 years of Stuff Rider magazine. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm only going to be talking about 3 editions of Soweto Speaking. The one that appeared, all 3 of them have appeared in magazine issues in 1979. The first one in volume 2, number 2, where she speaks to Ananias Ndaba, an unemployed, that one, an unemployed plumber who lives in Soweto, and a Mrs. Flora Mweketsane, who has difficulty accessing her husband's late pension, as well as 2 editions of Soweto Speaking, where Tladi speaks to Sergeant Moloi. I'm interested then here in studying what Tladi's non-fictional work reveals, thematically, theoretically, as well as to hesitate at the gates of fixing her non-specific fictional writing, to question rather than take genre boundaries for granted. I want to argue, following the work of the African feminists Spencer, Ligaga, and Musila, that we rattle the gates of the non-fictional boundaries that Tladi crafts, rather than assume them to be self-evident. Pausing at the lines of what Hedley Twiddle calls documentary modes allows us to read them differently in ways that recognize a continuum, a range from long-form analytic journalism and reportage, experiments in oral history, microhistory in archival reconstruction, life writing, memoir, and the essay. In the first of these columns, Ananias Ndaba asks as many questions from Tladi as he answers. He is curious about her recent return from a residency in Iowa and about her constant return from the many countries where there are no passes and therefore more freedom. This is curious to him. She is in conversation with him in the beginning of this column. He notices that she does not appear happy whereupon she briefly narrates a story of a strange white man who entered her house in Soweto, who entered her house in Soweto, and how she was aware of his presence only when she heard a strange voice speaking on her home phone in her lounge. The story itself is fascinating, relating how the story itself invites Ananias then to tell his own story of a similar event he experienced as a plumber, relating how a managing plumber ignored the Black employees in an Edenvale house where Ananias and co were working to use the bathroom. Inside this Edenvale house was a white woman who was not South African, and this seems particularly important in Ananias's retelling, who was so outraged at this white man's sense of entitlement that she emerged in her dressing gown, grabbed him by the collar, and pushed him out of her house. In her audible complaint to the firm that had sent him, she complained loudly about how he had just walked past the other people in the house, her servant, and barged into her bathroom without using his mouth. The tale in this column is presented as comical, but it is also analyzed. Tladi's shared tale enables Ananias to narrate his own story in much detail. There's a shared experience between the two of both anger and humor. There's no return to Tladi's story, even as she retains tight control on the writing of the narrative. It is used only, her own narrative is used only as a way to surface not just the story Ananias tells, but also a particular aspect of Black life and Black-white interaction under apartheid. He recognizes this as the kind of permission that white men take with Black people and assumed dominion over all domestic spaces, and relates a story that will eventually lead to his own decision, Ananias's decision to work as an independent plumber to leave the firm. I will return to this. In the accompanying story of Mrs. Flora Mweketsana from Jabavu, Tladi takes on a different narrative stance, titling the story The Soweto Not So Merry-Go-Round, an interview. Mweketsana's story, unlike Ananias's story, is presented without interruption by Tladi. Whereas Ananias's cigarette smoking, probing, and cigarette-stained teeth paint a visual picture as Tladi constantly comments not only on what Ananias says, but what he looks like, what his gestures are, interpreting him for her reader, Mrs. Mweketsana is unmediated after the byline that tells us simply that her husband died on 17 November 1976, that this is her story as she told it to Miriam Tladi. This is a story of how this woman has been pushed from pillar to post, from the Bantu Commissioner's office in Braamfontein to the West Rand Administration Board offices for her late husband's cards, to the Labor office, and eventually being handed a check. This is an extract of her narrative. They filled the cards and at the time gave me a check for 16 rands, which they said was my husband's pay for the week. They had not paid him, and his holiday pay, which was due to him at the time of his death. Is this all I must get? Yes. How can it be? My husband has been working all along. His unemployment, UIF, has been withdrawn from his pay all these years. He's never drawn it. It's your fault. You said your husband was a Botswana person. I never said that. How can I say that? My husband was born in Zeerast in the Transvaal. He only changed his pass and took a Botswana passport. He has been working here all along and he lived here all along. There's nothing we can do to you. It goes on like this. And she keeps fighting back and going back and moving from with increasing ire from office to office. Her anger is palpable. She elicits eventually the help of her brother-in-law to no avail, and eventually by the end of the column has decided to approach the Black Sash for assistance. Elsewhere in the magazine and in her writing appearances at FUBA, Miriam Tladi constantly asks questions about absent women in writing, in artist and performance spaces. Notably here in this column, and elsewhere, the only time Tladi concedes space in her column, Soweto Speaking, is so other women can speak in their own voices unmediated. In the second column, in the second and third column, the two-part column that appears in the June, July, and the November, December issues, Tladi interviews a Sergeant Moloi, who's interviewed in two parts in what Tladi describes as his comfortable home that houses multiple generations of the Mulois. Sergeant Moloi himself is described as charismatic and popular. He shares this house with his children and grandchildren in Rockville. He's a veteran of the Second World War and describes himself as a good soldier, and he has traveled across the globe, was a prisoner of war in Egypt, about which he relates. And this is reported by Tladi. I'm going to quote from Tladi. He was united. So this is a way he's talking about being a prisoner of war in Egypt in the Second World War. He was united with a former white colleague of his own that he had not seen since there were municipality policemen arresting Africans for passes in the streets of Johannesburg. Sergeant Moloi was then Sergeant Major, and Van Eck, a driver stationed in Marshall Square, now known as John Foster Square. He related how later, as a war prisoner in the hands of the Germans, they parted because Van Eck would not attempt to escape. Being the daring soldier he was, Sergeant Moloi decided to adhere to the instructions he had received while undergoing training as a spy in his country to always try to escape. He and a friend named Shawa took the plunge and succeeded. Then began Sergeant Moloi's long, arduous, and heroic journey of 20 days through the desert, in the midst of which Shawa resolved to take a different direction, and he wandered alone. Finally exhausted, hungry and thirsty, but as determined as ever, Sergeant Moloi stumbled into El Alamein and the safe hands of the Allied forces. As a trained spy, his expert knowledge and wide experience in the desert led to the successful destruction of enemy camps in the desert and to the sinking of ships. These three pieces that I've accepted from are theoretically productive. Elsewhere, I have written about how political transgression, coded as heroism and named simply as Stuff Rider behavior within this magazine, is written exclusively as masculine terrain in Stuff Rider fiction, and of how women are habitually and theoretically written out of heroism through violence, through the figures of repeatedly raped Black woman characters, or through silence as stoic suffering wives and mothers in Stuff Rider, in order to ensure that Stuff Rider possibilities are unavailable to women characters. Nebele's writing on the spectacular South African Black literature as a theatrical performance of Black embodied defiance of white supremacy, which eschews fictional portrayals of Black life and interiority, is a critical intervention in criticism of Stuff Rider representational technologies. However, its universalization in what Makubane might call a curious theoretical odyssey has led to the dismissal of very different kinds of writers. Indeed, many writers labeled as working within the protest tradition, including Tladi, deploy such varied writerly strategies that literary critics would ordinarily hesitate to see them as more than mere contemporaries. In other words, the analytical category protest literature does not hold. It is successful only as a means of non-engagement with the writing of Black artists as writing, as literary. Tladi needs to be read against this vein too, even if she does not occupy this position in exactly the same way as her male contemporaries. Tladi's position is a complicated one, I'm wrapping up. One that complicates how we think and write about Stuff Rider. As a co-founder of the magazine, she nonetheless disrupts the central tenets of the magazine as expressed in its pages and as interpreted in much of the scholarship, but remains somewhat illegible. As Barbara Boswell demonstrates, even Ndebele misreads Tladi's painstaking attention to the ordinary, as he lists her among the writers who imagine Black life only through spectacle. This is somewhat confusing, Ndebele's reading, given Richard Reeves' description of Tladi's representational idiom as subdued and modest, Unlike Lockett, both of them, unlike Lockett, who detects a simmering anger, a reading Tladi herself endorses by stating that she writes a lot of anger into her Black woman's responses. This anger is developed into full feminist rage in Tladi's play, which has not been studied at all. Barbara Boswell has shown how Black women writers, including Tladi, show up the anxieties produced under apartheid and enacted by ordinary white people who tried but failed at repeated clearing, almost ritualistic, of the public space of Black people. Boswell notes that Tladi and Ngcobo carved intellectual spaces that enable them to critique dominant ideologies of Afrikaner nationalism and white supremacy, while imagining and writing alternatives to a nation to which their relationships were primarily of disavowal and dispossession. Often read as a mere record of Black life, these columns require further scrutiny, mindful of Twydel's range and guarding against Musila's epistemic disarticulation, which is implicated in readings or avoidance of Tladi's work through critical disengagement. Musila teaches us that epistemic disarticulation is less about ignorance and more about the inability to acknowledge multiple modes of knowing and their accompanying indices of credibility. Here, as elsewhere, Tladi problematizes the taken for granted aspects of Black life and how Black life may be imagined and rendered, revealing interpretative authority from an independent plumber, juxtaposing modes of heroism inhospitable to one another in the popular and admired retired soldier who was also a blackjack. So we see him as both hero and villain on the one hand and exceeding both on the other. The unmediated woman speaker, Mrs. Muoketsana, is presented through very deliberate writerly strategies that poke at the boundaries of the representational regimes for women like herself in Stuff Rider. Intertextual readings triggered by these columns challenge the spatial boundaries of sense-making. And Dina Ligaga invites us to be suspicious of the normative in genre, because genres work within shared conventions. Because reading genre is in several of the African contexts, including Tladi's, requires a reading of boundaries for genre, allows meanings to weave in and out of texts in ways that signal their interwovenness with everyday life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pumla. And I love the description of Miriam Tladi's work of leaking through the boundaries, which is such an effective image. And I was reminded of Loretta Ngcobo's introduction in Footprints in the Quag and how the two of them are in conversation. So I'm excited to hear about Audre Lorde and Miriam Tladi being in conversation, which is just so exciting. Thank you so much. So we're going to go back to Dr. April, and to hopefully we've cleared up all those little gremlins. Dr. April, are you ready? Okay, we have a picture. There's still no sound. Oh my goodness. Take out the Nanzika. We copy. Now you're on mute. Can Tech please assist us? Nothing. Oh my goodness.
Can you try speaking onto your mic? Sorry, Dr. Masala. Okay, so her mic is definitely not working.
Did she log in and out?
Yeah, I'm just gonna talk to her on the side.
Okay.
Poncho, can we just take a 2-minute break?
Perhaps while we...
Thank you. This is a song that was written by my little girl. She wrote it for me after I had the honor and the chance of being chosen as one of the delegates from the Republic of Guinea to attend the independence celebrations of Mozambique. It was in Mozambique that I first heard the words in Portuguese, "A luta continua." When I came back, I told Bongi all what I saw. So I said, write me a song. She wrote the song. We have the habit of dedicating it to the people of Mozambique and to their vanguard party, Frelimo, and to the beloved Samora Machel. My people, open your eyes and answer the call of the drum. Frelimo, Frelimo, Samora Machel, Samora Machel has come. Maputo, Maputo, home of the brave, our nation will soon be as one. Frelimo, Frelimo, Samora Machel, Samora Machel as one. Given their lives, praises to thee, husbands and wives, all thy children shall reap what you've sown. This continent is a whole. My brothers and sisters, stand up and sing. Eduardo Mondlane is not gone. Frelimo, Frelimo, your eternal flame has shown us the light of dawn. Mozambique, a luta continua, a luta continua, continua. Oh, Mozambique, a luta continua, a luta continua, continua.
Revolutionaries die and the children forget. The ghetto is our first love, and our dreams are drenched in gold. We don't even cry. We don't even cry about it no more. Are the beautiful ones.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for bearing with us. It seems we're going to have to postpone Dr. April to tomorrow's session, just so we can continue with our program. And so we will still hear from her. We're just going to restructure the program, which is really unfortunate. So now we're going to start with our Q&A. And so please use the chat function. I know because of the new medium we're using, it's not like how we do with Author Fridays where people can voice in as well. So please use the chat function. I'm also going to check on my phone if people have sent me any messages. I do know there was a lovely comment in response to when Mam Tisani was speaking, which I'm just going to read, is listening to these grandmothers and mothers is wonderful, reminding me so much of my early schooling in Zimbabwe, how much we need the wisdom of stories and narratives told in this way. And this was from Barbara Kay on our live link on YouTube. It seems people can speak for questions. And I know, was it, oh, now I've forgotten the name. There was a hand up earlier. Please raise hands as well so I can indicate, and we'll just take a round of questions until we run out of time. While we wait, some more comments from our live link on YouTube. Lots of people saying just how awesome this is. Enkosi kakhulu, Mam Tisani. Very exciting and enriching discussion, Dr. Tisani. Tunzikazi Mbungwana making a comment on ukufukama. Ndiphuma nalo mfanekiso nesenzeko. Enkosi ngolu lwazi lufumileyo, Gqirha Tisani. A question from Dr. Barasa Sam, following, I think he's from Moi University in Kenya, which is very exciting. He says, or she says, great African educational historiography. We need to think of how to include the role of African women in the development of education in Africa. And so those were just some of the comments as well. I'm not seeing any raised hands, colleagues. Anybody would like to add a comment or a question? I see someone's written in Q&A. Linda Villagazi says, thank you for the rich tapestry of wisdom. Here's a question. How can we move with great knowledge and validation of African women excellence to the grassroots so all can be motivated and inspired to tell their own stories? And I think that goes back to what I think, I can't remember, it must have been Mam Tisani or perhaps Yvette talking about this idea of what does this mean? Oh, and Dr. Bama as well. What does this mean for Madlamini in the rural areas? So thank you for that, Linda. And perhaps that's a question that we can come back to when our panelists answer. Nomalanga has a question for Dr. Abrams. She says, can Dr. Abrams describe how doing her work outside of academia felt? So Yvette, that's something to bookmark, and as well as Linda's question to bookmark. I'm just waiting for a few more questions, and then maybe we can get 3 questions and take a round of answers. Okay, maybe let's start with those two questions. Yvette, do you want to start with Nomalanga's question and come back to us? Describe how doing your work outside academia has felt for you. And then anyone can comment on the question that Linda Vilakazi has had. And Nomalanga also says, obviously, I want to ask Dr. Tisane's comment on South African historiography as a body of work in light of what she presented. Mamdisi, I hope you can see that comment as well from Nomalanga. Yvette?
I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've always been energized by the space between theory and practice. Like my 5 years at the CGE, for instance, where you could literally implement whatever ideas people came up with, and you could go check it with grassroots organizations and go back to the highest reaches of government or the UN and propagate and you know that I just found that interface always very exciting, and not least because then and now I think, you know, one was always more likely to work with Black women and meet with Black women and practice Black women's epistemology in spaces of implementation rather than spaces of theory. It's changed, but you know, we still have a long way to go, and so I've always found it very, very energizing, and I suppose not least because, you know, I've always had sympathetic comrades inside academia, so it's never held me back in terms of writing or publications or you know, if I needed a spot to do research or a base, I think particularly the University of the Western Cape, but everywhere, you know, the cohort that I studied was Desiree Lewis, Habiba Badrun, Pumla Kola, and many more have always been there. So I think it's more a question, like I say, of synergies. I'm not one of those practitioners that discard academia at all. I mean, if I hadn't thought academic work was valuable, then I would not have been a commission at the UCT, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think it's more about how do you institutionalize sort of the personal pathways that I've developed? How do you create a conversation and a dialogue, and how do you bring the university to the township and the farm? How do you bring the township and the farm to university? And again, there's some incredible Black women who've been doing that work and who will continue doing that work. Of breaking down the walls and creating channels of communication and pathways of interaction. So yes, my experience has been a blast. I wouldn't have had another life for all the money in the world.
Thanks, Yvette. Dr. Tisane, would you like to comment on Nomalanga's question about historiography as a body of work in light of what she presented? And perhaps to say, Pumla, there's also a question for you from Uspagazi and a wonderful comment from Azrini Wahidin, which I'll read once we've finalized this round of questions. Mamdisi? Gazi, please unmute Mamdisi.
Have I been unmuted?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you for the discussion so far. It's been good. For lack of a better word, I was thinking of an English word which is going to tongue twist, exhilarating, something like that. But to respond to a South African historiography specialist like Kabazele, then I know I'm in trouble. The question is, I would like to hear precisely what you said as I consider as a body of work in light of what she presented. I'm simply staying the course of change in South African historiography. During the 90s, during the time of great expectations, we thought we would have time of a real rebirth, and in particular of the rebirth of history. Instead, we have had a South African history continuing to reflect itself against Western ways of revisiting the past. And therefore, when I talk of toppling the great chain of being, really, it is my swan song in terms of saying, what else can we do in order to understand the need for us to change? And how can we move forward unless we see that the African woman has got to be part of the human story? And the human story is incomplete without her. And that is all I'm trying to say. And therefore, even when we look at the South African history and we have accepted almost sacrosanct canon in terms of what is South African history, can we interrogate it in the light of the fact that the African woman is absent? And in the light of the fact how different it can be if we put her back as a member of the human race. The fact that under the great chain of being, the African indigenous woman is the lowest in the rank, this has affected thinking of all those who are above her. By the way, those who are above her actually do in very many different ways see as such. And that is why the whole issue of global sorority has no meaning for me. We can have all these feminist idioms, but they have got no meaning for me. And that is why the Western binary dance about black and white is actually meaningless. Because whether you like it or not, if you agree and define yourself as black, you'll be black until there is no color. And by the way, black is no color. It means you'll never be anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am Desi. Prof. Gola, you want to come into that question? It's actually from Janine Jones, who's under Spogazi's account, who is asking, would you mind repeating what you said at the end of your work about genre, how it is always understood within frameworks? It is so important, and I would like to hear it again, precisely what you said, as I consider the genre translated in France is gender.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Jones. I was saying, yes, I was using some of Dinali Gaga's work to think about the way in which, even though we often take genres for granted as self-evident, once we feel we have identified them, that in fact we need to remember that they do normative work and that they work within certain conventions. And I think that in the case of Tladi specifically, very often her columns have been, her essays on censorship, for example, have been completely understood. They're very seldom studied. But her columns and the ways in which she writes they're very literary columns, are very often described when they are anthologized, very seldom subjected to critique, but often anthologized for a time, very often slotted under journalism, which in many ways allows then for them to be read simply as a record, as a mere transcript and a record of Black life under apartheid, of Sowetan life under apartheid. Even as that simple categorization of journalism sits oddly with what we know columns do, because columns, of course, in any kind of print media format don't just report. And it's called a column. So we're just speaking, it's called a column repeatedly, but it's treated in the critical reception or the avoidance of critical engagement very often as just journalism. And so I suppose I was using Dinali Gaga's invitation then to remember that genres work with shared conventions, and in fact we need to reread the boundaries and trouble those boundaries in order to allow for meanings to weave in and out of texts in ways that signal, she says, their interwovenness with everyday life. And so my reading is much of what Tladi is writing in her columns, as in her other essays, is very similar to how she's conceiving of and how she's writing. She's imagining characters, especially women characters, but not exclusively. She's constantly writing kind of gendered blackness and gendered whiteness in very particular ways that are very different from many of the people she's often slotted in with. In her fiction, it seems easy to insist that she is engaged in the same project. But in fact, when you pay attention to her nonfiction, it becomes much harder, which seems to me linked to why her nonfiction, because it is illegible in the ways that Grace Musila speaks about cognitive, what is it called, epistemic disarticulation. It makes it impossible to read her columns, whatever genre we decide they are, unless if we recognize that they are not just reportage and just a recording. The writing strategies, the content, the treatment makes it very difficult to continue to make the kinds of arguments that are made predominantly, with the exception of a handful of feminist critics of Tladi's work. It becomes very difficult to continue to make those arguments about her falling within the protest tradition, although the protest tradition is itself a very problematic category, which is in many ways a non-category, because it holds writers that sometimes have nothing in common at the level of a state. They only have something in common in terms of where they live sometimes, or how they defined in terms of the kind of apartheid register, but nonetheless a category that has been incredibly powerful in defining the landscape of South African letters. So I guess I was just, and with Ligaga, who studied something similar elsewhere, arguing that we, in fact, a rereading of Tladi's work requires a troubling of the assumptions we make about genres and what genres can do, as well as about those categories that contain her, but in fact that she habitually leaks out of.
Thanks, Pamela. That was really great detail as well. Before I read Azrini's comment, colleagues, just to say, you can indicate by raising your hand, and we can actually activate your audio. We'll unmute you to add your question. Azrini says, this is one of the best conferences I have attended. Thank you. There's a division between rural and urban women in terms of gender equality. Thus, how can we reach women in rural parts of South Africa to address economic, socio-educational inequality? And that's from Professor Azrini Wahideen. And I think that could be for any of the panelists, and even Dr. Bam, perhaps, because you spoke to some of that. And there's a comment for you, Dr. Gola. That was wonderful. You gave me that, and what I need to consider these matters more seriously. Oh, that's from Ginny. Any comments about Professor Azrini Wahideen's comment there? Perhaps, Yvette, I'll start with you if you would like to respond to that question.
Sorry, would you please repeat the question? I didn't realize it was directed at me, so I haven't.
Sorry, I was just picking on you because there was it was something related to what you had said. So she says, there's a division between rural and urban women in terms of gender equality. Thus, how can we reach women in rural parts of South Africa to address economic, socio-educational inequality? And I wanted to start with you, but of course, Pumla and Mamdisi can also add their thoughts as well.
Well, interestingly, when I was at the CG, we did some work around women and energy, and we had 9 provincial workshops, and we went to the very, very rural parts of provinces and asked women, well, what do you need? And they all said, well, we want solar panels so we can charge our cell phones, which is pretty much the most unexpected answer that we that we could have thought of. But for them, cell phones was connectivity. It let them speak to their daughter in town. It let them speak to their mother perhaps in another area. It allowed the children access to Wikipedia and so on. So for me, that's always remained a very important metaphor for how we do the work. You know, that we can protect the environment, save the planet by working solar panels, but that it can speak very directly to rural women's basic needs and allow them access. So I think breaking down the digital divide, I mean, Ms. Brigelio is very correct in pointing out that with the new possibilities that are offered, 5G and so on, we are in danger of broadening levels of inequality, not as in the poor becoming poorer, but as in those of us who are wealthy can suddenly access so much more. And so to give real thought on how we do sort of unified work, you know, how we attack a problem from, well, that's a violent metaphor, how we approach a problem from very different angles and try to accomplish very different things with very simple measures. And may I say, this is my grandmother in me. You know, who was a rural woman, a farmer, and she kept chickens and eggs. And her husband, who was very enlightened for his generation, allowed her to keep her chicken and egg money and send her daughters to university, which nobody else was doing in Namibia at the time. My mother was the first Namibian Black woman to ever get a degree. And I often say people look at Dr. Abrams today, but they don't see the chickens and the eggs. So that rural woman is not that far back in our ancestry. She's not that far away from us. So in addition to sort of the practical work, I would say, well, you know, discover the rural woman in yourself, discover the rural woman in your ancestry and reconnect, because that wisdom and that knowledge is what enables us to be where we are today.
Thanks, Yvette. Mamdisi, would you like to comment as well?
Thank you. Ma'am, can you pick me up? Can you hear me? Thank you. I actually would like to echo what Dr. Yvette has just said, that the divide between the women is artificial. That's the first thing. This whole rural-urban divide is artificial. The urban woman must have a consciousness and awareness of what being rural means. And it may not be directly through her own experience, but through her connectivity with her past, and even more importantly, with her historical past, what makes her. So I really echo what she's saying. And again, to pick up the point that she's made, that when women in rural areas were asked, what would you like to have? Because there is this paternalism. I'm happy that it is not paternalism, not maternalism, that people operate from when they engage with people described as rural, as if they are not enough and as if they are incomplete. And that the women simply responded, we want solar panels. We want to live our full humanity. We are tired of being peripheral. We want to be inserted back into human history. We are humans as well. And if we, as we speak, and if officers in government departments perhaps can be exposed to a new and better thinking than the whole notion of rural equals underdevelopment, rural equals ignorance, rural equals poverty. Yes, they'll be poor if no one takes them seriously, if no one builds roads for them in order that they can be connected. They'll be poor. But if they are attended to, then the rural women will be we will be proud of them and we will celebrate them. And the fire inside us, the rural women inside, will be ignited and will be better people. Thank you.
Thanks, Mamdisa. And I think you're echoing some of what Linda Vilagazi had raised as well. And before we move on to the next question, I see there are 2 more questions. Pumla, did you want to respond to that question as well?
No, I think I think Doctors Tisani and Abrams have covered it sufficiently.
Thanks. So our next round of questions, I'm going to start with, there's one in the anonymous attendee column. How can we bridge the yawning gap between intellectuals and academic feminists, for lack of a better description, on the one hand, and what's usually referred to as ordinary women on the other, for the latter to understand theory and universality of their oppression, and the former to be informed by daily experiences of the latter and also be activists? And then there's a second question. I think it's back to this theme of the rural and the urban, and if anyone wants to add more to that, but I think we've covered that. How can we ensure that the connectivity between the rural and urban is understood, especially by our young ones who were born in urban and have no experience, direct or indirect, of the rural? So that's stretching the question a bit. So perhaps, Pumla, if you'd like to start by responding to that first question about the yawning gap between intellectuals and academic feminists. I hope you can see the question because it's quite detailed.
I think that I'm not sure. I mean, I think we have to first question this notion that I'm not convinced that that the yawning gap is a permanent fixture, right? So I think I understand. I mean, I'm not dismissing the question. I get what the question is asking, but I do think that we need to kind of the question is actually quite a complex one. So first of all, the history of the South African kind of women and gender studies or feminist studies in the South African Academy is that, in fact, many of the people who teach and do feminist research in the academy, the masters and coursework in women and gender studies and in feminism and so on are very new in the South African Academy. And so, in fact, the bulk of the people who do, until very recently, feminist work in the academy are rendered feminist, are made feminist outside of the academy. So I'm not entirely sure that we can as easily speak about the yawning gap between academic feminists and activist feminists, because many, like I said, many of the first and second, and I mean first and second, and maybe even now into the third generation of academic feminists in South Africa don't come to feminism in the academy. They come to feminism from some other place in the academy, and they bring it to the academy, which is a very different history, a very different trajectory than we see for the same time in many other places that have a longer academic presence of feminism. Secondly, I think that it often appears as though academic feminists have a much more interesting and kind of secure place within the academy, which is in fact, in the main, at least in the South African Academy, the Southern African Academy, and perhaps in the African Academy, and not exclusively, it's a much more tenuous position. So I want to trouble this notion that we have this big separation between academic feminists and feminists who do feminism outside the academy that can be called activists. And in fact, there's a long tradition of problematizing this in African feminists, in African feminist scholarship, not just South African, but we see it in the West African tradition. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is certainly what I try to do in my paper. I mean, Miriam Tlali is not an academic; she's a writer, And I think, and perhaps it'll be clearer in the longer version and not the presented version of the paper. What I try to argue is, in fact, that we need to recognize the ways in which interpretative authority, in which theorization, in which abstraction, in which kind of thinking at a conceptual level is something that happens often in many places. That is not, it's not the exclusive domain of the academy. And in fact, and you know, people like Desiree Lewis argue this, Barbara Boswell, Atambile Masola. I'm only mentioning those. I mean, I could mention many more people. I mention those people because they work in the same kind of discipline. So I'm talking about. So there's extensive work that in fact tries to trouble the notion that there's an intellectual, there's an intellectual tradition that is the sole domain of the academy. Feminists outside the academy are theorizing all the time, and in fact, you know, part of what I was trying to argue is this. And then finally, I think we should trouble this notion of feminists in the academy versus ordinary women who are something else, who are not also, because I mean, nobody really lives in the academy exclusively. That in fact, you know, people's lives move all the time. And I certainly, even if there was a clear sense of kind of a feminist academy that was distinct from the realm of women that was not feminist and that was not in the academy, I think it would be very dangerous, in fact, for feminist academics to presume that they are the custodians of the project that needs to move in that way. I think what we have in the main is a movement historically in the South African Academy that goes in the other direction. Sorry, I don't know what my screen is doing.
No, Siyakuva, thanks for making those comments. And perhaps as we draw to a close, Yvette and Mamdisani, I'd like to bring you in if you would like to respond to any of those questions already, or just provide us with any closing remarks as we draw to a close. Maybe I'll start with you, Mamdisani, and then end with Yvette if you've got any closing comments.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Ma'am.
Thank you. Well, my closing comments is that it's been a good experience, and the speakers coming from different angles, but at the same time, it is possible to link up the corners from which they come. And for me, that is possible if we look at the fact that in Africanist thinking, inclusivity is at the core, so that the binary divide propounded by Western epistemology is going to delay any progress you can make in creating new and appropriate thinking without measuring ourselves up or mirroring ourselves up against Western universalizing thinking. I therefore appreciate that we have Dr. Gola from literature, and we have Dr. Abrams coming with something completely new about the third way, which I actually believe strongly in as well, that we do not have a one way of unraveling or defining reality that is monopolized by a particular outlook or approach. That we have a third and a second and a third way. And thanks for that, Dr. Abrams. Well, it's been special to have Mamu Bam. I simply want to say Mkiwa, Skonza. So if you are 87, I'll have to keep going and stop complaining about not being able to handle technology or any other thing. Thank you.
Enkosi Mamdisi, Yvette.
Thank you. I just want to thank the organizers of this conference. I find it so exciting, and I have to say these times of coronavirus through great tragedy are also proving to be times of incredible potential. You know, so to the point, speaking simply even as a reader, like I'm not even keeping up with all the bright young Black feminist writing that's being done, even just like, oh, maybe this week I should just read young queer writers, and even just fitting in that time by the fireside is becoming a challenge. Now that's a great problem. That's the kind of problem you want to have, you know. So all I can say is, you know, thank you so much for creating a present that is delightful and creative and profound in the work that's being done, and looking forward to the future that you're going to create.
Pumla, any last words? Thank you so much, Yvette.
I just want to say thank you very much to all the for all the questions and all the comments, and also just an appreciation to the keynote and my co-panelists, and of course you, Dr. Masola. And I just wanted to say to Dr. Abrahams, you did always say that the PhD was volume 1. And I know we tease you sometimes about volume 2 to volume 9, which exist in text form as well. Perhaps I shouldn't say that, but it's been incredible to listen to you and to watch you perform the various poetic renderings of volumes 2 to 9, and not, even though some of us would still like to get the textual versions as well. And it's good to speak after her, so she can't answer me.
Very sneaky of you, Pumla. Just to echo everyone's gratitude and awe, really it's been such a privilege and an honor for me to be part of today's program. As I said at the beginning, it's been my treat to actually be part of a panel of all my favorite people. Poor Yvette has had to deal with me while I've been trying to get all sorts of other things, and then I slid in this invitation when I was ordering my products from her. So thank you so much for being so gracious, Mamdisi. It was amazing. Dr. Bam, your words are still reverberating, and we're really just so grateful. And we chose this topic really to echo what everyone has said, Inyathi Buzwa Kwabaphambili, for this very reason, that there's still so much we can learn from our elders who live and breathe and laugh and live amongst us. So thank you so much. As you can see, we've shared the program for tomorrow. We'll start a little later tomorrow. Thank you, Prof. Buka. This has been church for me, even me too. Just to say, I even dressed up today. I put lipstick on. I have a new dress on. I used my new products from Koi Life. So I really came for the occasion, and it was really more than I could have asked for. So back to tomorrow's program, everyone. You'll be starting at 2 o'clock tomorrow, where we will have a keynote address by Professor Shireen Hasim, who will be joining us all the way from Canada. So notice also how transnational we are in our program. You can start logging in from about 13:45, and then our speakers will be facilitated by Dr. Spokazi Magadla in the second panel discussion, where we will have Nomfundo Xaluva speaking about Miriam Makeba. We'll have Nika Cornwell speaking about Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. We will have Sisa talking about Joyce Mujuru, and we will have, oh, it's so small, Sivuyisiwe Wonci speaking about the Flawless Movement. And thank you. And then end off with Tulisile Msezana, who will be speaking about Lebo Matosa. And so please join us tomorrow. You really don't want to miss out. And just to say, with the technical glitches that we had, I know earlier I said we would have Dr. April joining our panel tomorrow, but we found that she was not available tomorrow. And so we've scheduled her for the 18th of September at 1 o'clock. I suspect that's probably one of our Author Fridays. You really don't want to miss out on Dr. April, people. Like every time I've been on a panel with her, she's delivered the goods. The first time I heard her speak, she recited a beautiful poem about Mam Charlotte Matlage. You really don't want to miss out on that. And yes, thank you to all there's lovely commentary happening in the chats as we end off. Thank you everyone for really gracing us with this afternoon. And so as we end off, we're going to end off with another song. We began with a song and we'll end off with another song that I am looking for. And we're going to end off with, Brenda Ndambo's Mhlaba Wethu to end off. And we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.